George Harrison was often called the quiet Beatle. He didn't talk much in interviews, and he didn't like the spotlight as much as John Lennon or Paul McCartney. But George had his own charm. Born in Liverpool in 1943, he was the youngest member of the Beatles. From an early age, he loved music and was obsessed with the guitar. While his classmates were busy with sports or schoolwork, George was practicing chords and dreaming of joining a band. When he first met Paul McCartney, he was just a teenager. Paul introduced him to John Lennon, who wasn't sure if George was old enough to join their group. But after hearing him play, John changed his mind. George became part of the Quarrymen, which later transformed into the Beatles. Though quiet, George had a sharp wit and a spiritual side that made him different from the others. He was a thinker, often searching for deeper meaning in life. In the early days of the Beatles, George didn't write many songs. Most of the spotlight went to John and Paul, who quickly became the main songwriters. But George was patient. He studied their craft, learned from them, and quietly worked on his own ideas. Slowly, he began to write songs that showed his unique style. Even though he wasn't loud or demanding, George's presence was powerful. He was the balance in a band filled with big personalities. At first, George Harrison's role in the Beatles was mostly as the lead guitarist. He added sharp riffs and solos that gave their songs a distinctive sound. But deep inside, he wanted more. He wanted to write songs, not just play them. For years, John and Paul dominated the songwriting. George would bring ideas, but they often didn't make the cut. That rejection frustrated him. Still, George didn't give up. His first real breakthrough came with the song Don't Bother Me in 1963. It wasn't a massive hit, but it was important. It proved George could write. As the Beatles grew, so did George's confidence. By the mid-1960s, he started contributing gems like If I Needed Someone and Taxman. These songs showed his style, thoughtful lyrics, unusual chords, and a touch of sarcasm. But George was different from John and Paul. He didn't write for fame. He wrote to express feelings, often deep and spiritual ones. He wanted his music to mean something more than just entertainment. This is what made him stand out. His songs carried emotion and honesty that connected with fans on a deeper level. Even though he was often overshadowed, George's persistence paid off. By the late 1960s, his songwriting had reached a new level. He was no longer just the quiet one. He was becoming a force within the Beatles, ready to show the world that he could stand beside John and Paul as a songwriter. George Harrison's life took a dramatic turn in the mid-1960s when he discovered Indian music and culture. He was fascinated by the sitar, an Indian instrument he first heard while filming the movie Help. This curiosity led him to meet sitar master Ravi Shankar, who became his mentor. Through Ravi, George was introduced not just to Indian music, but also to Hindu philosophy and spirituality. While John and Paul were caught up in fame and success, George was searching for something deeper. He felt that material things weren't enough. Fame hadn't given him peace. It had only created pressure. Indian philosophy offered him a path to inner calm. George became deeply interested in meditation and Eastern religion. This changed not only his personal life, but also the Beatles' music. Songs like Within You, Without You showed George's growing influence. The track, filled with Indian instruments, was unlike anything the band had done before. It wasn't just a song, it was a spiritual statement. George believed music could open people's minds and lead them toward higher understanding. His search for meaning sometimes made him feel distant from the rest of the band. While John and Paul argued about business and songs, George was more concerned with the soul. But this was exactly what made him unique. George wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing truth, and in doing so he gave the Beatles a spiritual depth that no other band of their time had. By the late 1960s, George Harrison had fully come into his own as a songwriter. He was no longer just a background player, instead he was writing some of the best songs the Beatles ever recorded. His masterpiece, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, appeared on the White Album in 1968. The song revealed his emotional depth, blending sadness with beauty. Eric Clapton, George's close friend, even played the iconic guitar solo on the track. Then came Here Comes the Sun and Something from the album Abbey Road. Both songs became instant classics. Something was so powerful that even Frank Sinatra called it the greatest love song ever written. George had finally broken through the shadows of Lennon and McCartney. His songs weren't just good, they were timeless. But success didn't come easily. For years, George had to fight for his songs to be included on Beatles albums. John and Paul were protective of their space as the main songwriters. George often felt frustrated, believing his music deserved more recognition. Despite this struggle, he stayed persistent, and by the end of the 1960s, his songs were standing tall beside Lennon-McCartney's best. This period was George's creative peak within the Beatles. He had grown from a quiet guitarist into a true songwriter. His music carried sincerity, depth, and beauty. For many fans, his work became the soul of the Beatles' later years, showing that the quiet Beatle had the loudest voice of all. As the Beatles grew more successful, tension inside the band also grew. John and Paul were often at the center of arguments about creative control. George, who had always been patient, began to feel left out. Despite writing incredible songs, he was still given limited space on albums. This frustration built up over time. In January 1969, during the filming of Let It Be, George finally reached his breaking point. Tired of constant arguments and feeling unappreciated, he walked out of the studio. For a brief time, the Beatles were reduced to 3 members. George later agreed to return, but the cracks in the band were now impossible to hide. The situation was made worse by business disputes. While John and Paul were focused on the band's company, Apple Corps, George was more interested in making music and exploring spirituality. He felt trapped between their egos and constant fighting. Even so, George managed to deliver some of his strongest work. Songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun reminded everyone of his brilliance, but the tension couldn't be ignored. George once described life in the Beatles as being like a school where you're not allowed to graduate. He was ready to move on. By 1970, the Beatles finally split. For George, it was both painful and liberating. He had lost the band that made him famous, but he had also gained freedom, the chance to create without limits. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, many wondered if George Harrison could succeed on his own. John and Paul were already seen as the main songwriters, so expectations for George were lower. But George shocked everyone with his first major solo album, All Things Must Pass. The album was a masterpiece. Filled with songs he had been saving during the Beatles' years, it proved that George had been underrated all along. Tracks like My Sweet Lord and What Is Life became worldwide hits. My Sweet Lord even reached number 1, making George the first Beatle to top the charts as a solo artist. What made the album so special was its honesty and spiritual depth. George wasn't writing just about love or fame, he was writing about life, God, and the search for peace. The music had a sense of freedom, as if George had finally taken a deep breath after years of being overshadowed. The success of All Things Must Pass shocked critics. Many even argued that George's solo debut was stronger than the early solo work of John or Paul. For George, this was vindication. He had always believed in his music, and now the world did too. The album wasn't just a career highlight, it was a cultural moment. George had stepped out of the shadows of Lennon and McCartney and proven he was a genius in his own right. In 1971, George Harrison showed the world that music could be more than just entertainment. It could be a force for good. His friend, sitar master Ravi Shankar, told him about the humanitarian crisis in Bangladesh, where millions were suffering from war and famine. George felt he had to do something, so he organized the Concert for Bangladesh in New York's Madison Square Garden. It was one of the first major charity concerts in history. George brought together some of the biggest names in music, including Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, and Ringo Starr. The event was a massive success, raising millions of dollars and inspiring future charity concerts like Live Aid. The concert proved George's vision. He wasn't interested in fame or headlines. He wanted to help people. His song Bangladesh also raised awareness worldwide. Through this event, George showed that a musician could use his platform for something much greater than himself. The Concert for Bangladesh became a symbol of compassion in the rock world. While other musicians were focused on careers and fame, George was building bridges through kindness. For many, this was the moment when George Harrison truly became more than just a Beatle. He became a humanitarian, a man whose music and actions spoke louder than words. After the massive success of All Things Must Pass and the Bangladesh concert, George Harrison faced new challenges. Fame brought pressure, and expectations for his music were sky high. While he continued to release albums, not all of them were as well received as his debut. Critics sometimes called his work too spiritual or too serious, but George didn't care about trends. He wrote from the heart. By the mid-1970s, George's life grew complicated. He struggled with exhaustion, personal issues, and the demands of the music industry. His marriage to Pattie Boyd, once a great love story, ended as tensions rose in their relationship. Pattie later left George for his friend Eric Clapton, a painful chapter in his life. Even with these struggles, George remained true to himself. He released albums like Living in the Material World and 33 1/3, each showing his blend of rock and spirituality. While they didn't always match the success of All Things Must Pass, they built a loyal fan base who admired George's honesty. What made George different from his peers was his refusal to chase fame. He often joked about how he disliked the spotlight. For him, music wasn't about staying at the top of the charts. It was about sharing truth and emotion. This attitude made his career unique, unpredictable, but always authentic. In the late 1980s, George Harrison surprised fans with a new project that brought him back into the spotlight. Along with Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison, and Jeff Lynne, he formed a supergroup called the Traveling Wilburys. The idea started casually, just friends making music together, but it became one of the most beloved bands of the era. The Wilburys released songs filled with fun, humor, and warmth. Unlike his solo work, this project wasn't about deep spirituality or pressure. It was simply about joy. Tracks like Handle with Care showed George's lighter side, and fans loved it. The group's success proved that George didn't need to stand alone. He could thrive in collaboration, just like in the old Beatles days. Working with the Wilburys gave George a new sense of energy. He enjoyed the freedom of not being the center of attention. Sharing the stage with legends he admired brought him peace. For once, there was no pressure, just music and friendship. The Wilburys reminded the world of George's talent, but also his humility. He never acted like a superstar, even though he was one. He laughed, played, and wrote songs as if he were still that young boy from Liverpool who loved the guitar. The Wilburys became one of the happiest chapters of his career, showing a side of George that was light, playful, and free. In the 1990s, George Harrison lived a quieter life. He focused on his family, gardening, and spirituality. Fame no longer interested him. He still made music, but he preferred peace at home over the chaos of tours and headlines. His private life in Friar Park, his estate in England, gave him comfort. But in 1999, tragedy struck when an intruder broke into his home and attacked him. George fought bravely, surviving the incident, but it left deep scars. Soon after, his health began to decline. He was diagnosed with cancer and spent his final years surrounded by loved ones. Even as his body weakened, George's spirit remained strong. He continued to write music and share love. His final album, Brainwashed, released after his death in 2001, was filled with wisdom and heart. It was his last gift to the world. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58. Fans around the globe mourned the loss of the quiet Beatle, but his legacy lives on, not just in songs like Something or Here Comes the Sun, but in the way he lived. George showed that music could be more than fame. It could be spiritual, healing, and compassionate. He was a Beatle, yes, but also much more, a seeker, a humanitarian, and a true artist. His legacy continues to shine, reminding us that sometimes the quietest voices leave the loudest echoes.